Order, order. Can I welcome the committee and our witness to the first panel we have today on our final session on combating new forms of extremism. Dame Sara, would you like to introduce yourself and then we'll go into questions?
Well, good afternoon, committee. Thank you for inviting me here today to give evidence. As Karen said, my name is Sara Khan. I used to be the Counter-Extremism Commissioner and I was Commissioner between 2018 to 2021, where I produced a number of official reports for the government. And then I was appointed by the government to be their independent advisor on social cohesion and resilience, and I published the last official review into threats facing social cohesion and democratic resilience back in March 2024.
Thank you very much, Dame Sara. And we're going to start our questioning with Joni Reid.
Thank you very much for attending today. As you've just outlined, you have a kind of long history and accomplished career in countering extremism. How, in your experience, how has the landscape around extremism changed, and what are the new kind of threats, and what should the government's priorities be in tackling it?
So I think in the absence of an extremism assessment framework, I think what would be helpful for me is to highlight what I think are two really important trends in relation to extremism. And the first is that I believe Britain is in the midst of an evolving and accelerating extremism landscape. So we've seen how there's been an unprecedented number of prevent referrals in the last year, 27% increase. If we look at the rise of hate crime, again, significant numbers, in particular an unprecedented number of anti-Semitic incidences, anti-Muslim incidences. We're seeing worsening youth radicalisation, where we know 1 in 5 young people are being investigated for terrorism, and it's under the age of 18. Less talked about, but which I think is really, really important, is how we're seeing an older generation of predominantly 40, 45 to the ages of 65 of men who are increasingly being influenced by extremist narratives, conspiracy theories, and engaged in criminality and violence related to that. The rise in political violence. We know that in the last general election, just under half of candidates had experienced abuse, threats, intimidation, violence, but this isn't something that's just affecting politicians. When I did my review, it was very clear that this was an issue that was affecting people from across all walks of life, members of the judiciary, civic society groups, people working in academia, teachers, people working in the arts and culture sector. So there's a growing climate of that level of hostility. We know from MI5 and CT policing about the increase in foreign state interference, hostile threats and so forth over the last couple of years, and how in particular a lot of that activity is seeking to undermine social cohesion and fuel extremism. We're seeing, unfortunately, even during my time at the Commission, I think it's got incredibly worse now, is the brazen and open activity of domestic extremists, whether it's Islamists, neo-Nazi extremist groups. And I'm talking about extremist groups that fall just below the terrorism threshold. So they are not proscribed and they are in effect allowed to operate freely. And we've seen them operate on our streets, chanting all kinds of things, whether it's Globalise the Intifada or the Tommy Robinson rallies, actively promoting things like the Great Replacement Theory and so forth. Online, of course, is another significant challenge. And I think, when I was at the Commission, I think Twitter was still in existence at that point, and many of the prominent extremist influencers at that time had been banned by Twitter. Under X, many of those people, around 150 or so, have come back, including people like Tommy Robinson. And even if you just look at the scale of online extremism, I know there's been huge discussions about how that is a growing threat, but just to give one very clear example, if you look at the scale of anti-Semitic content and posts, so I was reading a report recently where I think it was from the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust, which showed that 3 years ago, around, I think, 500,000 anti-Semitic posts were being put up in a year. That now has risen up to 1 million a day, and that's in the last 3 years alone. So that just shows you the scale of that challenge. And I think we're also just seeing a kind of, which we didn't see, I think, during my time when I was at the Commission, is this mainstreaming of extremist narratives. So, for example, the calls for remigration, calls for ethnic minority British citizens to be deported. That used to be a clarion call of the extreme right wing, and it was very much confined to the fringes of the extreme right wing. I think that has mainstreamed and moved from the fringe into the mainstream in a way that I've not seen previously. Now, having kind of said all of that, I think it's really important to point out that you can't there's no analysis of extremism without also understanding how resilient we are as a society. You know, what is the state of social cohesion? What is the state of our democratic resilience to help us weather the ability to measure that threat? And I think that very much brings me on to my second trend, which is that unfortunately the reality is we are seeing and witnessing declining social cohesion in this country, where we are seeing declining levels of civic participation, increasing levels of polarisation, the levels of disillusionment with democracy in our country. I mean, if you look at time series data over the last 4 decades, the level of trust in Parliament, in political parties, in the government is downward. But I think it's the scale and pace of that trend which I find incredibly concerning. So if you look at data from the British Social Attitudes, for example, it highlights how, you know, in the last 5 years alone, the level of distrust around government and putting the interests of the country before the political party in power has doubled in the last 5 years alone. And so you've got this growing climate of worsening extremism threats, declining levels of social cohesion, declining levels of democratic resilience, and all of those things are very much interconnected. And I think when you stand back and look at that picture, it is deeply concerning. And you know, when I've gone and spoken to schools, charities, local authorities, they are all struggling in knowing how to deal with these issues because they don't fall under the remit of prevent. They don't necessarily fall under the remit of social cohesion. We can talk about that more, but there is unfortunately a gaping chasm in Whitehall in how they deal with extremism and these threats to social cohesion.
So do you think then, given what you've just said about the lack of that approach, but also you've outlined just the seriousness of the situation, do you think we should be looking at a counter-extremism kind of social cohesion government strategy which cuts across various departments and possibly, and you mentioned as well, an assessment framework?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's something that I recommended in my review back in 2024 and in subsequent reports that I've written. That I think, you know, if you look at the examples of, say, the summer riots, it really showed how you can't separate extremism from social cohesion, which is what Whitehall does at the moment. And departments get very funny about, well, this is our area of policy. We don't want, you know, the Home Office getting involved in MHCLG's work and vice versa. But the reality is that if you look at, for example, the summer riots, you know, here you had prominent far-right extremist groups, usual kind of suspects, Britain First, Patriotic Alternative, Tommy Robinson and others who were fueling the fire, who were spreading disinformation and conspiracy theories and extremist narratives. How you had foreign influences and foreign actors again spreading that disinformation and conspiracy theories. You can see that where the riots took place were in areas where social cohesion was often low and the indicators of social cohesion were low, where you were seeing high levels of deprivation, even concerning levels of disillusionment with democracy and distrust of authorities. So, you know, trying to kind of demarcate, on the one hand, the role of foreign states and the role of foreign interference, and then separating out extremism, and then separating social cohesion, in my view, has just been totally counterproductive, because that's just left us in the dark in understanding, well, how are these things actually linked? Why is it that in some parts of the country the riots happened, and in other parts it didn't? You know, what the factors that were involved? And I think in Whitehall, we have a very outdated way in the way we look at cohesion, democratic resilience, the way we look at extremism. And it's just not fit for purpose. I mean, I was reading a report actually just today about how, I think there was a report released just recently by the Resilience and Reconstruction Group that showed that if you look at how disinformation is operating in the UK, and in particular in relation to disinformation about Ukraine, which is being spread by Russian-aligned narratives, but how that's migrating from the margins to the mainstream in the UK, and how it's being done through familiar domestic figures like Tommy Robinson and others using algorithmic feeds, how they are then blending grievances and stories about local issues, two-tier justice, institutional failure, and how by using those concerns, you're kind of having a slow drip feed, and how that is changing people's perceptions into supporting extremist and anti-state narratives. And again, it just shows you that these things are inextricably linked. You know, it's almost like a triangle if you think about social cohesion, extremism, and democratic resilience, or a square if you want to also include the involvement of foreign states. Now, Whitehall just doesn't look at it like that. And even though, you know, we have all of the work that's the way the national security infrastructure deals with foreign state interference, if you look at the Defending Democracy Task Force, its primary responsibility is to be how do you deal with democratic foreign interference, for example, in our elections. But the whole of the kind of national security infrastructure and the national security strategy itself, it doesn't look at, well, okay, you're dealing with the threats, but how are you building resilience? How are you dealing with domestic extremism? How are you strengthening social cohesion to ensure that we're able to withstand that problem? Because I'm afraid then that's just going to mean we're going to have a very limited success in dealing with the role that foreign interference is having, but also in responding to our own domestic extremism challenges. So, you know, what I'm really calling for is a completely new, radical way of looking at this issue. And, you know, you rightly asked about the lack of an extremism framework, which, you know, I have to say I just find really disappointing, because we're so much in the dark about where, for example, the extremism hotspots across the country, where is social cohesion fraying? I mean, one of the things that I've realised throughout the many years I've worked in this area is how often extremists are really very well fine-tuned to understand where weaknesses are in local communities, and they target those areas, how Islamist extremists will target vulnerable Muslim communities who may have grievances about anti-Muslim hatred or feel that there's no sense of belonging here, or the same on the far right, where they feel that people have grievances around legitimate concerns around immigration or other issues. And they are very good at targeting those areas, and I feel like we're very much on the curve and behind on all of these issues. So I think being able to measure extremism, measuring these other relevant factors is really, really important. I don't think it's difficult to do. I just don't understand why Whitehall hasn't done that in all this time. And it would also help us to understand and develop an early intervention scheme to see where the red signs are flashing, what more we should be doing at an early stage, which we could have done perhaps with the summer riots. And I think it was really interesting to see the HMICFRS also come to that conclusion, where they said that because of the lack of intelligence and the risk assessment, we don't have that information. So I think it's really important that we build that framework and analytical capability to help drive a new approach to taking a much more effective approach to dealing with this problem.
Thank you for that. My final, very quick question is, how do you think that's best achieved or delivered then? How do we get that coordination? Would it, any model that you have in mind?
So I think, I believe that either the Home Office could set up a new directorate whose responsibility is dealing with counter-extremism, threats to social cohesion and democratic resilience, which cuts across government departments, that works obviously with the Department for Education, that works with DCMS, arm's length bodies and others, where there's a clear relevance to this type of work. I think it has to be distinct from prevent. I am not of the view that this should be part of the government's counter-terrorism approach. I think part of the problem and we can talk about this more, is this conflation between extremism and terrorism, and what we think and expect prevent to do, and what actually its remit actually is. So I think that you could have a cabinet director, you could have a director inside the Home Office, or even possibly the Cabinet Office, and alongside that there should be, I think, a new strategic approach or a strategy, a counter-extremism, social cohesion, democratic resilience strategy that builds a kind of whole society approach to help us meet this growing challenge in our country.
Thank you very much. Very comprehensive.
Thank you for coming. You've moved on to a point I was going to ask you about. You're on record of bemoaning the fact that extremism is conflated with terrorism and the lack of a legal definition of extremism. How should we define extremism?
So it's a very important question, and when I was at the Commission for Countering Extremism, never mind a legal definition, just the definition of extremism itself has been a very complicated and controversial debate. Coming up with a credible definition of extremism, I think, is really important for a number of reasons. The first is because we've got to be very clear about what is the activity we are concerned about, where we know, on the one hand, there's a growing challenge and threat of extremist actors, extremist groups that are seeking to undermine our democratic way of life and also fuel terrorism and violence on our streets. But also having a definition is important because it's important as a liberal democracy to make clear what isn't extremism. So no matter how horrific, violent even, offensive certain type of activity is, it's important that we don't say, well, that's extremism. So I think it's for that reason that it's really, really important. So when I was at the Commission, we did a whole load of work. And in effect, I spent 3 years coming up with a definition of extremism, which is in the Operating with Impunity report, which was published in 2021. Now, the government in 2024 published an updated definition of extremism, some of it which was used from the Operating with Impunity report, which I think is actually quite a good definition. It's a big improvement from the 2015 definition. I've not necessarily called for a legal definition. I think what's important is firstly having an operational definition of extremism, and I don't think the current definition of extremism has been operationalised, because when it was published, I think the election was called around 2 months later. So it's never really been operationalised in the way that I'd like to see it be operationalised. But what I have called for, as I wrote in the Operating with Impunity report, which was co-authored with Sir Mark Rowley before he was appointed as the Met Commissioner, was that we need a new legal framework to counter the activity of hateful extremists and extremist organisations. And that could be civil, it could be criminal, it could be regulatory. One of the challenges we've had in this country for around 2 decades now is dealing with extremist groups and actors who fall just below the terrorism threshold, who promote the same extremist narratives, conspiracy theories as prescribed groups, but because they don't engage in terrorism or violence, we in effect have no ways of dealing with them. And Anujam Chowdhury was a classic example of that. For years, authorities just did not know what to do with him, even though we all saw for ourselves how he was radicalising people into terrorism, how he was fueling far-right extremism, was further fueling Islamist extremism and promoting anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred. We did not have the legal means to stop him. And I think, to give credit to David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, he tried to put forward an extremism bill, which sadly fell flat on its face for a number of different reasons. But I think the intent was absolutely right, that it cannot be right that we have now, in this case, for example, we've prescribed national action, but why is it that we've got other neo-Nazi groups like Blood and Honour, White Vanguard, Homeland Party and others, who are neo-Nazi organisations in this country, who are clearly radicalising children, radicalising people, promoting the same narratives, who, while they may not engage in terrorism, they are clearly anti-democratic and are seeking to use democratic means to undermine our democracy. Why are we not doing something about that? And so I think, one of the suggestions we made is that I think we need a level of what I would call hateful extremism prescription orders, where you've got hateful extremist groups who don't meet the threshold for terrorism, but who are clearly and persistently engaging in the same activity as terrorist groups, bar the violence and terrorism, but that we're allowing them to, in effect, just operate freely. I don't think that's acceptable.
You would need a legal definition of extremism, then?
You don't necessarily need a legal definition. I mean, look, we don't have a legal definition of stalking, for example, but we have powers to deal with stalking. So, when I've spoke to, for example, counter-terrorism policing or the National Policing Advisors for Hate Crime, when I spoke to regulators like Ofsted and Charity Commission, what they want is powers, because one of their concerns is that we're expected to deal with, again, extremist actors, extremist groups, who again fall below terrorism, and it's what I'd call hateful extremism. I've written extensively about this and the distinction of hateful extremism from terrorism. We're limited to what we can do. So if we've got extremists, possibly as school governors, or extremists as trustees of charities, there are no legal powers for us to do anything about that, because there is no legal, there's no legislation around this. And again, when I've spoken to policing, they'll say, well, what do you want us to do about extremism? Because there are no legal powers to deal with extremism. And I think, I'd encourage the committee to read Operating with Impunity, because what we show is that the two areas operating with impunity. And so what we show in here is that the 3 areas of law most relevant to hateful extremism is hate crime legislation, in particular the stirring up of hatred offences, but also counter-terrorism legislation. And one of the things we show is that when it comes to hateful extremism and the activities that we've defined it there, we don't have legislation that was designed to tackle hateful extremism. We've got, we deliberately as a society created legislation designed to tackle hate crime, to terrorism. What we have failed to do over the last 20 years or so, while the extremist threat was growing, was not outlaw those hateful extremist groups that fell just below the terrorism threshold. And so it's something I would definitely encourage the committee to relook at.
We will. It's not time now to explore whether or not you do need legal definitions, but could you, in a non-legal definition, offer me a definition of extremism? What does it mean to you?
Gosh, so I can give you the definition that I published back in 2021, and which we said was that it's activity or materials directed at an out-group who are perceived as a threat to an in-group, and there's a lot of psychology around that which I'm happy to explore, which is motivated by or intending to advance a political, religious or racial ideology, which is similar to the terrorism definition in terms of these are people who are motivated or intending to advance an ideology, A, to create a climate conducive to hate crime, terrorism or other violence, or B, are attempting to erode or destroy the fundamental rights and freedoms of our democratic society, which are protected under Article 17 of the Human Rights Act, which talks about how there is an obligation amongst democratic states to protect the democratic norms and freedoms which extremist and totalitarian groups seek to exploit. That's a very long-winded...
No, that's helpful. I'll come back to it when I come to this question later.
But again, I think the government's definition right now is also very good.
Thank you.
Robbie Moore.
Just as a quick follow-up as well, just on the point you were making about community cohesion, do you think there's a responsibility on the state, whether it's national government or local government, not to address key issues? And I use a very quick example in my own constituency of Keighley with gang-related grooming, child sexual exploitation, where there is an argument where social cohesion is not happening, and therefore because there has been a lack of direction by local national governments over many years on this particular issue, that then social cohesion breaks down, where there is a lack of sensible conversation, sensible direction on issues like that then drive lack of social cohesion and then more extreme views.
No, on the contrary, I think it's really important that we do talk about those issues, because I think the failure to have done so has fueled the breakdown of social cohesion. It's fueled far-right extremism in this country, without a doubt. And I'm from Bradford myself, so I'm very familiar with the challenges around Asian grooming gangs, and I've never been fearful to talk about it. I think it's really important that we do talk about it, and it's really, really critical. I remember in places like Rotherham, where because state agencies failed to listen to victims and listen to the families of victims, people who had never supported far-right extremist propaganda ever, when you had far-right extremist groups come to Rotherham and organise protests, and you see the fathers of these victims joining because they feel so let down by statutory agencies who didn't believe their daughters in the name of social cohesion, you've in effect given a bowl to the extremists. And so, on the contrary, my view is I feel very, very strongly that we have to talk about these issues. We can't shy away from them, because the failure to do so only further fuels extremism and erodes social cohesion.
Yeah, well, I'm really, really pleased to hear that, because Nick Griffin stood to be the Member of Parliament in Keighley back in 2005 on that very issue. So it just builds into the point you're making about social cohesion breakdown. Just turning on to the question of young people, what are the main drivers behind the increase in young people being radicalised in your view?
Gosh, it's funny, isn't it? Because I kind of look back now and think, why are we even surprised that we're talking about the radicalisation of young people? I think, give it 20, 30 years' time, I'm sure the next generation will laugh at us and think, well, what did you expect was going to happen when young people were exposed to unregulated social media content? I remember reading one poll where I think it was something like 73% of 16 to 24-year-olds have been exposed to either hateful, extremist, terrorist or violent content online. That's almost 3/4 of our young children being exposed, and to young adults being exposed to that content. I think for a long time we fail to remember that throughout history and throughout time, extremists have always deliberately targeted young people. They've always sought to radicalise young people. Even during the Second World War, we saw the deliberate targeting of young people. And so whether it's Islamist extremists, far-right extremists, there's always activity around recruiting and targeting young people. And so I think it's, there's a number of things. There's a whole range of different movements. There's the 764 movement that's aimed at young people, which, is incredibly worrying. But I think I don't think we can just pin this on social media. This is about, what does education look like? Are we building resilience in our young people? How equipped is our education system to build resilience around extremist narratives, whether we're talking about digital literacy or building citizenship? What does it mean to live in a very plural democracy like Britain, where we celebrate living in a diverse and different and pluralistic society? How resilient are our families in being able to withstand extremism? I mean, I've come across cases where, there are protective factors and there are risk factors where some children, their families and their parents have acted as protective factors to their children being exposed to extremist content. At the same time, I've come across families where it's the parents that are radicalising their children. So, extremism and young people being exposed to extremism, you have to look at it through a wide variety of issues.
And one of those undoubtedly is social media. And
Yes.
we have seen the rise of AI, and we've seen the rise of algorithms changing, so content is being fed, and then polarisation of views. We all know that. I wonder what your views are on how we address that, and we've seen the Secretary of State today give a statement in the House on looking at rolling out another consultation on whether or not we should or shouldn't ban social media for those of up to the age of 16. Is that something that we should be exploring as a government? I'm firm in my views. I think we should be banning it up until the age of 16 to try and address these issues. Yes. Just keen to understand your views.
I mean, on the issue of banning, I haven't come to a final conclusion. I think probably because I feel quite conflicted about it. I mean, as a parent, I have 3 daughters. My instinct naturally is ban, just ban it all. But I think at the same time, I don't necessarily think that's going to answer all the questions. I think it'll be interesting to see what evidence and data comes out from Australia. And I was reading something by Molly Russell's father, Ian Russell, in the Times today. I don't know if people have seen that piece, where he doesn't support the banning of social media for children under the age of 16 and looking into the reasons why that may be. So, it's really hard. I mean, from a counter-extremism perspective, my instinct is that probably banning would be helpful because they are being exposed to extremist content. In particular, which we've kind of touched on already, is how a lot of the extremist content is currently classed as legal. So it's not being dealt with sufficiently by the Online Safety Act, and I don't believe Ofcom will be able to deal with it effectively either. But I think it's, do I think that the current generation of, say, 15-year-olds, will it help them? It may not necessarily help them because they've already been exposed to that content. How do you develop that digital literacy and resilience within them? Perhaps in the next generation of young people, I can see it probably being an argument where this is not going to be debated. It would be very, very helpful for the next generation. I mean, my youngest is 4. I mean, I think it'd be fantastic for her not having grown up with social media. We're banning it for under 16 is just not going to be an issue. So I can't give you a clear-cut answer because I think I'm still trying to understand where my position lies on this.
And just finally from me, you mentioned the education point to do with not only digital but media literacy. What would be your recommendations on how we should try and address that in educating parents with young children or those teenagers themselves, those young people themselves, beyond the social media world, but wider education?
There's obviously digital literacy. There's broader debates around, as I said, citizenship. There's a lot of interesting data now looking at also, I mean, how do you combat conspiracy theories? Pre-bunking, there's a lot of the work looking around pre-bunking conspiracy theories, countering disinformation. What does that look like? And so it's just making sure that I think the national curriculum is able to deal with those issues, whether it's dealing with the threat itself and equipping them or actually seeking to build resilience. There's probably a lot more that I could talk about that. Which I'm happy to kind of share later on with the committee in writing, if that would be better.
That'd be helpful. Yeah, thank you.
Ken Maguire.
Thanks, Chair. Talking about actually tackling some of this extremism, we've touched on social media and the online harms, and obviously there's been the AI controversy and scandal with the horrendous grok images that came out a few weeks ago. Where do you think the government should be prioritising their resources to tackle these new forms of extremism?
So I think probably a number of ways, and it probably touches on what you asked me earlier, which is that firstly, it's important to understand what is the government doing to counter extremism at present. The reality is not very much. We had a counter-extremism strategy that was scrapped in 2021, and that again worked across different departments, worked in the education sector, worked across a whole range of issues. That's all gone, and all the resources and funding that was linked to it has all gone. So that's a real concern, and as I understand, I don't think there's anything in the budget that's been allocated specifically to counter-extremism. And so the funding for PREVENT is very different to what would be funding to deal with extremism. So that's the first thing. If we even look at social cohesion, there is no social cohesion plan or strategy either at this moment in time. The hate crime strategy, which is from 2016, so 10 years ago now, was due an update in 2020. In 2020, that's still not happened. The reality is extremism just seems to have fallen through the Whitehall gap, where nobody is really dealing with it effectively. Now, the Home Office will say, well, we're dealing with parts of it where if people who have extremist views, they can be referred to PREVENT, they will receive channel support. But the reality is, and I think this is where I think talking about PREVENT is quite important in trying to just understand what is and what isn't happening around extremism, is that the reality is that PREVENT really doesn't deal with extremism that falls below the terrorism threshold. PREVENT is a counter-terrorism strategy, often incorrectly labelled as a counter-extremism strategy. Its remit is not to deal with extremism. Its remit is to deal with terrorism. So if you look at even at the objectives of PREVENT, it's about tackling the ideological causes of terrorism. It's about providing support for those susceptible to radicalisation. But if you look at the Home Office's definition of radicalisation, it's not radicalisation in the broader sense of extremist radicalisation. It's about radicalisation into terrorism. So the Home Office's definition of radicalisation is the process of a person legitimising support for or use of terrorist violence. And I think it's really important to understand that, because this is about thresholds. So, I've had many schools come to me over the years who've said to me, look, we've had young pupils who have spouted and support clear extremist propaganda. We referred them to PREVENT, and while PREVENT was concerned about them, they didn't meet the threshold for referral into channel. So in effect, there was no other safeguarding scheme for them to go to. And so even if you look at the PREVENT referral figures, and the last set of figures that were released, around 8,500 referrals were made, we know that around 1,472 were adopted by channel. Now that leaves around 7,306 referrals which were not adopted by channel. We know some of them went into the kind of police-led management scheme where where people who didn't meet the threshold for channel received support through other schemes. We don't know how many that is, and I'm not aware that data has ever been published. But the reality is what's happened to the rest of those people. There's thousands of people, and this has been my concern for a long time, who could be displaying and holding serious extremist views. We are not following them into whether they are engaging in other extremist-related activity, whether that's engaging in forms of extremist-related hate crime or violence or riots on our streets, or engaging in other forms of extremist activity. We're not looking at the link there. And so there is no safeguarding scheme to deal with those people. And so I think it's really important to understand where PREVENT starts and stops, and how we've got to break this assumption and this view that PREVENT is dealing with extremism. It is not. And it is not effectively. And one of the things that the Home Office will say is that we're dealing with, we're disrupting extremist groups that fall below the terrorism threshold. Now, when William Shawcross did his review, he was not made aware of what does that look like in practice, who's being targeted. But the reality is, I think in the last couple of years, a lot of the extremist groups like the Homeland Party, Patriotic Alternative, and many others, they've actually grown in influence rather than decreased. So, there's a real concern around what we understand to be that challenge, that PREVENT isn't dealing with it. And I think even when ministers and officials talk about the threat, often we hear, the threat, and they'll talk about, the greatest threat is the Islamist threat, followed by the far right. We have to, and I plead on the committee to perhaps put this in the report, but making the distinction between the terrorist threat and the extremist threat is important, because yes, when we're talking about the terrorist threat, The Islamist threat is a far greater threat. But when we're talking about the extremist threat, I'd put all my money onto saying that I suspect it's the far right extremist threat is the greater extremist, hateful extremist threat at the moment, which we're not measuring effectively and we're not doing enough about.
Would you say that there's space then for a middle tier version of Prevent, which looks specifically at extremism cases that don't meet the threshold? You mentioned 7,306 cases not adopted by Prevent. Does there need to be that space in the middle that's covered by a similar programme to Prevent, but it's not terrorism, it's extremism?
So for me, I think it's important to recognise that Prevent is fundamentally a securitised approach. Extremism is a societal problem. I don't think you should deal with extremism through the securitised approach. I think it should be dealt with through a societal issue rather than a security approach. What I would do with Channel is that I would broaden it as a safeguarding scheme where it deals and it takes in people who have terrorist concerns, who are susceptible to terrorism, who have extremist concerns and violence, so kind of people who are fixated on violence and other types of safeguarding concerns, and where then what Channel then does is then triage those individuals to different panels and support for help. Because at the moment what you're doing is you're just missing groups of people, whether the fact that we did miss people like Axel Rudikabana because he didn't show any coherent ideology, or individuals who fall below the terrorism threshold who then don't meet the current Channel scheme. So that's what I would do. I'd broaden its approach, and I think David Anderson kind of made a similar argument in his review last year, I think it was now, where he said that it should be broadened, and I very much agree with his recommendation on that.
We've got a few questions on specifics on that coming up. Yeah.
In terms of actually monitoring that and policing that, would you suggest extra resources for local forces, or would that be like an NCA ring-fenced extra pot of money that they get to police that and then triage, as you suggest, to other agencies as might be appropriate? Because I'm just aware that my local police force, Devon and Cornwall, are 3 million short at the moment compared to what they're expecting, so I can't imagine they'd be very happy if they had to pick up this kind of almost extra work, if you like, and not have the resources that come with it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think that what I really like about Channel is the current model. I think it's a very good model. I think it's one of the real stories of success for Prevent, without a doubt. And the fact that you do have these multi-agency panel schemes, all I just think is that, look, it's trying to recognise that, and many of these panels have to make difficult decisions where, again, it's like, here we've got somebody who's really spouting extremist views, but we're not too sure. Are we concerned that they may go on to commit violence or terrorism? We're not too sure, and they have to make difficult decisions where they don't necessarily know. And we obviously have seen cases where then some of those people have eventually, who weren't referred or even were referred, were rejected. And so I think broadening the scheme where then Channel becomes more sophisticated in its way, where it's then being able to triage and then make sure people are going through the right support schemes, whether at a local level or at a national level, and getting the help that they need. I think it's probably something we desperately need, because it just feels like to me that Prevent is struggling to deal with these challenges, and it feels like it's playing catch up, and we're always just worried about, every time we hear of a new story of somebody who's committed an extreme act of violence or terrorism, the first question I'm obviously asking myself is, has this individual been referred to Prevent? Yes or no, and it can be negative either way, whether they have or they haven't. So I just think broadening Channel would be a very helpful. I mean, I've not thought of everything how it would work, but I think as a starting point, it's probably something that we need to do to help us deal with this kind of evolving threat that we're now seeing.
And then just my last question, you mentioned earlier about cross-government working, and it reminded me a bit when Professor Alexis Jay came before the committee. She made exactly the same point, so it does seem to be a bit of a recurring theme across different governments. Just wonder if I could dig into that a little bit more and see what could be improved, particularly in this area of extremism.
I mean, I guess it's kind of what I touched on a little bit before. I mean, we do this with Prevent. Prevent is very good at working with the education sector, working with prisons, for example, on dealing with terrorist offenders. And so, I think what I would like to see is, when we're talking about counter-extremism, I've mentioned the relevance and how social cohesion and democratic resilience is inextricably linked, that you create a whole of society approach. And if it's a whole of society approach, you're going to need to take a cross-departmental approach. You're going to have the DfE play a role. And I mean, just very quickly on the point of DFE and youth radicalisation, which I didn't mention earlier. I mean, we've had 10 years of the prevent duty. We have had the Department for Education play a very important role in working with the education sector. And yet, despite that, we're still seeing a rapid rise in youth radicalisation. And I think, again, we have to ask questions why that is, despite the fact that we've had all the work that Prevent is engaged in. And that, again, Prevent on its own is just not enough in stopping that youth radicalisation, despite all that investment and work that's happening. Sorry, I just had to put that in there. But on your wider point around having that cross-departmental approach, it's absolutely needed. I mean, the current model of MHCLG saying, hands off, Home Office, we're responsible for social cohesion, and the Home Office saying to MHCLG, hands off, counter-extremism is our remit, is just nonsensical now. It's just so outdated. And actually, by working together in a much more coherent and joined-up way, you're going to be able to draw the links much more effectively, between, say, what's happening at a local level and with, and with policing, for example, where obviously MHCLG doesn't have a responsibility for policing. So I think it's trying to build a new model which has cuts across departments. I mean, there was a time, I think it was under the old counter-extremism strategy, where ministers from those different departments, what was set out was that they would meet every 6 months from those relevant different departments to coordinate and share insights. And again, that's a model that I think could be brought back to the table again, where ministers from those departments come together and share that information. But again, it requires thinking about this in a new way that is fit for the picture and the threat picture we're seeing at the moment.
Thanks.
Peter Prinsley.
Thank you very much. I'm Peter Prinsley. I'm the MP for Bury St Edmunds and Stowmarket. And thank you for coming this afternoon. And I've been listening with kind of growing dismay as you've been speaking.
Sorry.
Nothing you've said has particularly cheered me up, I have to say. You can see that in 2008, it says in your biography that you started a women's-led group called Inspire,
Yes.
which was to do with trying to deal with some of these problems, and that's quite a long time ago.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about that and what's happened to it since?
Gosh. So after the London bombings in 2005, obviously just under 20 years ago now, no, it has been 20 years, sorry, I and a couple of other Muslim women felt very aggrieved about the fact that there had been 4 British Muslims who thought it was acceptable to blow up and kill their fellow British citizens. And having felt really exasperated with existing predominantly Muslim-led Muslim organisations like the Muslim Council of Britain really not doing much about it, as a group of women, we decided to roll up our sleeves and do something about it. So we set up this organisation called Inspire, which was, I think it was the only women's-led counter-extremism organisation, predominantly focused on Islamist extremism, but then we broadened wider in the number of years. But our focus at that time was Islamist extremism, and so we were around for around 10 years, and very much also dealing with the rise of the ISIS threat around 2014 to 2016, 17. And we did a whole range of different things. We worked with schools and teachers and with young people, because there was so much demand about how do you stop young Muslims from being drawn into supporting Islamist extremism. This was at a time when we saw British Muslim families leave the UK to join and support ISIS. And so it was a very challenging, very little money, I have to say. We had the Home Office support some of our work. We launched a campaign called Making a Stand, where we brought together Muslim women from across the country. We launched a campaign in Whitehall, where we then led a roadshow across different parts of the UK. Working predominantly with Muslim women and young people, trying to show them how they could stand up to extremist preachers, whether it was in the mosque or in their local communities, to challenge the narratives and how to safeguard their children, and how their voices as women were really important. And we saw this time and again that actually some of the most prominent activists in countering Islamist extremism were the women, but the amount of abuse and backlash that they got from Islamists was incredible, actually. And I don't think the government, and the Home Office ever realised the extent of abuse, threats that those women often experienced. So it was, I have to say, it was one of the most inspiring times for me, but it was also one of the most challenging and difficult moments of my life, because it was incredibly difficult. And I think one of my frustrations at that time was the failure of not just the government, but I think just society who would see us as a problem because they saw us as saying, you're almost like fueling anti-Muslim hatred if you talk about Islamist extremism, despite the fact that we're concerned about our children being radicalised and we want to do something about it. We don't want to see our children being locked up for terrorist offences because extremist preachers are using our children as fodder. Sometimes we would just get a lot of abuse from people who would say that we're fueling anti-Muslim hatred by talking about Islamist extremism, which I find incredibly distasteful even to this day. That, in a very short nutshell, and there's a lot I could say about that, but that was kind of a lot of the work that we did at that time. But I think what it did give me was a very good understanding of what's it like at the grassroots level, how is extremism manifesting in our country, how extremists use disinformation, conspiracy theories, even 10 years ago, how they were doing this work, and what more we need to be doing to build that resilience and to counter extremism and to counter extremist narratives.
Thank you. So, I mean, it seemed to me that what you'd probably thought, which I'm sure is right, is that these young Muslim individuals, I think mainly men, come from families where there are almost always very decent mothers. And the idea of trying to get the women in the families to address this seriously was something that you took upon yourself, by the sound of things, all those years ago. And it seems to me like that's an initiative which has legs and might be worth reconsidering.
So, I mean, I never answered your question about what's happened to Inspire now. We looked for, after I left, because I'd taken on the Commissioner, Countering Extremism Commissioner role, we couldn't find someone to replace us. And the reason why, if I'm very honest with you, Peter, is because the scale of abuse and threats and intimidation we received was just off the charts. And I mean, a lot of women were just saying, why the hell would I want to do that kind of work? Like, it's just so hard and difficult, and the lack of support that you get and the lack of funding that exists. So it was really difficult. But I think, it's really important that whether it's faith communities or people in your own political circles, that you do almost police your own backyard. I mean, it's very easy, like if you're a left-wing politician, to condemn everything that's happening on the right, and vice versa. But if you've got extremists in your own backyard,
you have to deal
the moral duty, I think, is to call that out in your own community and in your own backyard, and say what's unacceptable. And also, I think it just sets a norm and a standard. For me, I mean, one of the things I've realised over the years about counter-extremism, that what really matters is leadership. Leadership, whether it's political, faith leadership, civic society leadership, is really important because it sets a bar, it sets a norm. And silence is the worst of all actions in the face of extremism, because you're saying what is acceptable and not acceptable in a society.
And leadership in families, probably.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's very difficult for parents. I think it's very hard, and I think we don't support parents enough. What do you do if your children are supporting and promoting extremist narratives? Do we give parents enough support of how to navigate that? And I don't think we do.
I'm going to ask a little bit about research and what the government is doing to fund research and what you think we could do to improve the research we're doing into this, to try and work out what best we could do. So if we had some research funding, say, how would you spend it?
I don't know what the government is currently funding on research. That's probably a question for the Security Minister. But what I would say is that I think there's probably a number of different things. The first is ensuring that we have a much better understanding of what works. What can be shown to be effective in countering extremism. And I don't mean countering violent extremism, because in the last decade and a half, there's a whole industry, the CVE industry, and there's a lot of work about how do you stop people going down the route towards terrorism. I think there are broader questions about how do you build social cohesion? How do what are the things that are effective? How do you change people's hearts and minds? If you've got, for example, as I was saying earlier, you've got a cohort of men between the ages of now 45, 65 who are adopting extremist narratives and conspiratorial narratives and engaging in violence and criminality. Okay, so what do we know to be effective? It's not as easy as just saying, well, they're a young person, we can put them through the Prevent scheme. It's easier, it's a much more complicated picture, and I don't think we have the research, for example, to know, well, how would you deal with that cohort of men, which doesn't feel like Big Brother, and is going to be effective. in changing hearts and minds in a way that is going to make people feel comfortable. I don't think we've got any research on that, actually, that it would be effective. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be looked at around how could tech be utilised to counter extremism. I'd love to see a lot more research on that. So, I mean, I've seen a little bit of work around how, for example, AI has been used to dissuade people from supporting conspiracy theories, for example. And so there's been some really interesting research where, because AI tends to be a lot more politer than human beings in saying, well, I don't think that's a really good idea, and do you know? There are ways technology could be utilised to, and AI could be used to kind of dismiss and support people from countering extremism.
So, for instance, you spoke earlier about the 1 million anti-Semitic posts a day. I think that was the figure.
Yes.
Is that 1 million people posting anti-Semitic posts, or is that some sort of bot which is producing millions of anti-Semitic posts which are just being distributed across the internet?
It's not people. I mean, I don't know the answer to that question, because that was research published by the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust.
Yeah. It's bots, isn't it?
No, it's both.
It probably is both.
So do you not think that there are technical fixes to that, using AI to
Definitely.
actually turn that stuff off?
And I think this is where AI can be very, very exciting, actually, and there are signs of this already happening, where AI could be used to monitor early detection of extremist narratives, conspiracy theories, disinformation, and intervene early in trying to take some of that content down.
Yes.
But again, so this is where we need more and more research around using tech to generate this work. I just think we're still slightly behind the curve.
I mean, the problem lies with the tech, doesn't it? Because if we didn't have the internet and the social media, we would have much less of a problem, actually. If it just relied on newspapers and leaflets like it used to, it wouldn't be the problem. So we need to somehow harness the power of the tech,
Definitely.
in particular using the AI
Definitely.
to counter this. And I think if we had research funds, that's how I would spend it, actually.
Well, I'd personally like to see social media platforms, with all the profit that they make, commit to, 2% of their profit to furthering research precisely on this issue.
And then finally, do you think that the anonymity of the people who post stuff is also part of the problem? So that, do you think it's reasonable for people to be able to just post stuff and not reveal who they are?
I mean, this has been, again, a long-standing debate over the years, and about whistleblowers, and so which I'm very sympathetic for. But I just think, look, in every other walk of life, we have to identify ourselves, and I think that we've gone long beyond that time where we think it's okay to have anonymous accounts. I just think that we've got to outlaw that. I think it's just ridiculous that we don't do that online, but we do that in every other walk of life.
So we could make a law, couldn't we?
Yes.
To outlaw anonymous posts like this.
Yeah, I think so. And I think in terms of, I don't know how we would deal with the whistleblower issue. And if people want to, I mean, again, I'm not talking about places like Iran, I'm talking about specifically about the UK, because again, that's a very different context about people wanting to, rightly condemn the authorities and so forth. I just think we've got to think much more about, there is a way of doing this in the UK, and I think it could be done. We just need to get the brains around the table to come up with it.
I agree, and we've got some good brains, so we should be able to do it. Yeah.
I hope so.
Are you okay to stay a little bit longer? Thank you. Paul Kohler.
Thank you. Again, turning to something you've written, you said, I don't want to know what the role of Prevent is anymore. What role should it have?
So the reason why I said that is because I think the role of Prevent on extremism is very confused. So, and I think that's happened for a number of reasons. So when Lord Carlisle did his review into Prevent in 2011, he argued that Prevent should deal with non-violent extremism. And when William Shawcross did his review, he also argued that Prevent should go back to its original aim of dealing with non-violent extremism, in particular Islamist extremism. But actually, if you look, like I said earlier, if you look at Prevent objectives, it is very much focused on counter-terrorism. But the misunderstanding that exists about how Prevent should be tackling extremism, is there. And I think what I'd like to see is for Prevent to say, we are not dealing with extremism that falls below the terrorism threshold. We have a different strategic approach. The government has a different approach to deal with that. And you know, I'll give you a very practical example. Stoke-on-Trent, which I went to visit 2 years ago for my last review. You know, this is an area that has had a long-standing history of dealing with both far-right and Islamist extremism. Now, for a long time, it used to be on the prevent priority list. And then in 2004, I think the then Home Secretary, Priti Patel, removed it because it didn't meet their criteria as a prevent priority area. And you know, the class that there's, you know, I think one of the main reasons was because it wasn't getting enough referrals, enough prevent referrals, and so they stopped getting the resources and funding that the prevent strategy would provide. It wasn't receiving funding from the then MHCLG's Integrated Communities Action Plan, because at that point it was only funding 5 areas. And the counter-extremism strategy, which was giving funding to Stoke-on-Trent, because that got scrapped, there was no funding there either. So a place like Stoke, and this happened in many other areas, where it was clearly dealing with a significant problem of extremism, again, below the terrorism threshold, but where you're talking about Islamist extremist groups actively on the ground, far-right and neo-Nazi groups on the ground and coming to the area, the undermining of social cohesion, threats to local officials and councillors, and there's no national strategic approach, and they very much felt like we're on our own here. We've just slipped through the net because we don't meet the prevent threshold, and it's like the government's almost kind of saying, right, guys, you just crack on and deal with this problem yourself. And so again, it's trying to understand how extremism is not necessarily dealt with by prevent. You know, prevent did not have a hand in trying to reduce the summer riots and the active involvement of far-right groups during the summer riots. It didn't have a contribution in that because, again, it's not the remit of prevent. But I think what I would like to see is prevent to be very clear about what its role is and what its remit is and isn't on extremism, and then for something else on extremism to take its place.
Take me through why you don't want to broaden out prevent, because other evidence we've heard from witnesses is the problem is linking it to counter-terrorism, and we want to take that out. And you like the channeling aspect of prevent and think that's applicable to extremism. So why don't you want to broaden prevent by taking out the requirement of the counter-terrorism requirement?
I don't think, I don't think, say if you've got young people, which is clearly a problem, who are increasingly becoming radicalised, I don't think it's helpful, and I don't think it gains the support of parents and communities if you then put them through a securitized program. It instinctively, and as we've seen over the years, just drawn up suspicion. I mean, that's why now we're only seeing, I think it's 1% of referrals into prevent are coming from families, and I think it's 2% of referrals are coming from communities, because in their heads they see this as it's a securitized national security. You've got counter-terrorism policing involved. It's all heavy, heavy, heavy from the top. You're just losing the support and confidence of people who feel like, what's going to happen to my child, if they go through this system? And so I think channel, yes, you could change channel so it becomes a broader system, and it doesn't necessarily sit under a security panel. Obviously, if you've got cases that are being referred to it and you triage it, then it can go down that route. But what I think is a much more effective way that is going to build trust amongst the people that you need to have trust from, who you want them to refer, is if they see it as a societal, educational approach rather than through a securitized prevent lens, counter-terrorism, national security. I think that's going to have a far more effective approach than to taking it down a national security counter-terrorism perspective.
So the problem with prevent is the initial triaging by the police. Is that what you see as the obstacle in addressing extremism? Is the fact that you couldn't use it current model because the triaging is done by the police at this currently?
Well, it's more than that. I mean, like I said earlier, prevent just doesn't deal with people who fall just below the terrorism threshold, or where if Channel feels that they are not susceptible to being radicalised into terrorism, they won't meet that threshold, so they just won't be dealt with effectively at all anyway. So it's a mire of a whole range of different factors, which is where prevent doesn't deal with extremism. Which is why when I was at the Commission, I came up with this phrase of hateful extremism, and the whole point of it was to say hateful extremism as a phenomenon is different to terrorism. This is why it's different. Here are all the harms. And the point of that was to say, now you can build an assessment framework to measure it. making sure you understand the difference between the extremist threat versus the terrorist threat. All of that's just now got lost in the last couple of years. And again, but that distinction is actually what we need, because we're still conflating terrorism and extremism. Well, where are the thresholds? Should X be referred to channel or, but do they meet the threshold? We don't know. And it just all becomes really confusing. And so that's why I said earlier that I'm confused about what the role of prevent is.
Yeah. I'm trying to get my head around how it would emerge. So are you saying there should be, prevent should be there, and absolutely should be there, counter-terrorism, and then a quite different process, borrowing bits of the channeling for extremism, but a quite separate referral process, etc.
The work of Prevent is absolutely critical in our country. Their role, the work of Prevent in stopping individuals from being drawn into terrorism is absolutely critical. We don't often hear about the success stories. We always hear about the stories that have gone wrong. But actually, we need a Prevent, and we need an effective Prevent strategy. What I'm saying is that I think channel could be broader. You can broaden that safeguarding scheme to include other forms of extremism, other forms of violence, fixated violence and others, that Prevent didn't have to grapple with, say, 20 years ago when it was first, when the idea of Prevent was put together. It's the times have changed and we have to evolve with the times. So what I'm saying is you do need to continue with Prevent. It needs to continue to be part of the counter-terrorism strategy. But in addition, alongside that, we also need a counter-extremism, social cohesion and democratic directorate and strategy and a framework that looks at how this is a different problem we're talking about that we're not dealing with effectively. And having both of them, for me, is the ideal, because then you're not going to, in effect, then really miss anybody, because what we're doing at the moment. We need both of those strategies working alongside each other. We just don't have the extremism part at the moment.
I think we say about channeling being broadened, but at the moment you're going to get to channeling when you've gone through the police triaging process first.
Or through the education
How
sector.
do people who aren't experts say, right, I will send this person to the counter-terrorism stream, the prevent stream, or I'll go to the extremism?
Well, that's what you'd have to develop inside Channel. You'd have to have a...
Well, you don't get to channel until you've gone through prevent the police at the moment.
Yeah, no, of course.
The channeling is going to stand above rather than below.
The multi-agency panel will then decide. That panel made up of local authority officials, people from mental health, the police, people from the education sector. They all sit on that panel where they then decide, do we refer them to the channel scheme where they will actually, their case will be adopted. They make that decision. What I'm saying is that channel could be...
First stage.
It's the first stage. But then what I'm saying is you develop the training, you develop it, and improve where you have experts who would then decide this person doesn't necessarily need CT support, they need much more wider societal education, it may be the better route, perhaps they need other sources of support, necessarily than the kind of wider counter-terrorism support. So that's what we haven't got that system. That's what I would like to see. No. But I think there's leverage in thinking about how can we expand that and develop the training to make sure you have got expertise to make sure you're triaging in the right place.
I'll get told off by the chair, but one last question and then I'll shut up. Given that one of the routes out of that channeling process would be the security approach, wouldn't it still therefore cause problems for families because they see where their child might end up or their loved one might end up? Given that is one of the routes out, won't it still have the same problems of suspicion of the process?
I mean, look, that's a system we already have in place. I think there are questions about why is it that to this day we're still not seeing enough referrals from families and communities, and I mean that's been going on for years now, and I don't think we've seen an increase in those referral figures, and I think we need to go back and look at that. But it's still a voluntary scheme. Referring people into prevent and people being adopted for channel is still a voluntary scheme, and so all we can do is, and there's been a lot of discussion about whether it should be made compulsory. But the fact of the matter is it's still a voluntary scheme, and if you have people in this country who are clearly susceptible and are being radicalised in terrorism, of course we've got to have a scheme which then they go through, and where some of them have very successfully then been de-radicalised, others less so. But we clearly have to have, the government has a duty to make sure that it does have a scheme to stop people from being drawn in. So that's a system that's still happening and it needs to continue.
I'm going to bring this session to a close now. I do want to thank you, Dame Sara, for your answers. You've given us an awful lot to think about, and we've got the Minister coming up next, so there'll be questions we'll have for him. But thank you once again for all your help and answering of the questions. If you have any other thoughts after the session you think we should hear about, then please do let us know. But I'll bring this to a conclusion. Order, order. Order, order. Can I welcome the Minister to give us the final panel for this inquiry we've been conducting on new forms of extremism. We've just had a very useful session with Dame Sara Khan, and the committee has lots of questions. But I think, Minister, you wanted to make an opening statement, and Mr. Emmett, I suspect you want to introduce yourself. So maybe, Mr. Emmett, if you introduce yourself, and then we'll then we'll let the Minister do his opening statement.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Jonathan Emmett, and I'm currently the Director for Counter-Terrorism in the Home Office.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Well, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to contribute to your important work and your inquiry. I think it's a statement of truth that counter-extremism is a deeply challenging and complex area. The predominant extremist threat in this country comes from Islamist and extreme right-wing ideologies, and tragically, we've seen recently a sharp increase in both anti-Semitic and Islamophobic discourse and incidents. We are clear as a government that no one should be made fearful for their safety on the basis of prejudice. Our fundamental values, such as freedom of speech, freedom of worship, and democracy, define us as a society. As such, everyone has both a right and a responsibility to challenge extremist narratives. Now, extremists often deliberately operate below legal thresholds. However, where their activities do fall foul of the laws, they will be investigated and prosecuted. Where ideological hatred leads to serious violence designed to influence the government or intimidate society, that's terrorism. Our response to the threat from terrorism is clear and is set out in the UK's counter-terrorism strategy Contest. As part of our Contest, our Prevent programme has, since 2015, delivered interventions to support nearly 6,000 people at the risk of being drawn into terrorism. Now, recently, there's been a significant focus on the risk from individuals who are not motivated by a particular ideology, but instead display a fascination with extreme violence and mass casualty attacks. We've already taken steps to look at how Prevent works alongside wider safeguarding mechanisms to ensure that it offers support to the right people. Home Office efforts to counter extremism focused on the highest harm threats in direct support of our core counter-terrorism and wider national security missions. However, it's clear there are areas where we must, as a society, consider going further. Of particular concern to me is the role of the online environment. The speed with which hateful and violent content can spread online is, of course, unprecedented. What is unacceptable offline should not be acceptable online, and platforms which enable the dissemination of illegal material must be properly held to account. Now, government must play its part, not only through the Home Office's work on counter-extremism, but also through MHCLG's efforts to strengthen community cohesion. However, this challenge cannot be met by government alone. Society also has a vital role to ensure that extremist narratives are confronted wherever they arise and that our shared values remain the foundation of a safe and inclusive society. I welcome the committee's scrutiny on these important matters, and I very much look forward to your recommendations.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to start with Bel Ribiera-Addy.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister. I want to start by asking, what are the potential consequences for wider society if extremism is not tackled?
Well, as I know the committee will know, in the work that you've been doing and in the work that you all do as individual members of Parliament, there are potentially very considerable implications should government not be able to get a check of these particular issues. I mean, one of the things that we're ensuring that we are able to do is make sure that our response is as joined up as it properly can be across government. In the relatively recent reshuffle, the Prime Minister took the decision to ensure that the Security Minister sits both in the Home Office and the Cabinet Office. And that is in part an acknowledgement that the particular complicated challenges that we face to our national security and in the areas that you reference require the most effective joined-up response. So that is the approach that the government is seeking to take. But I think that the committee will be very well aware of the risks that come alongside narratives that are not properly challenged and where we don't have the correct procedures to respond in the most appropriate way. I don't know whether you want to add anything to that, Jonathan.
I would only add, Minister, that we see extremism at the upper end as a clear driver of national security risk. Certainly in our counter-terrorism work, there are moments where we have to consider things which fall below the legal threshold for terrorism, but which nonetheless present conditions that are permissive towards radicalisation. So that's absolutely something that we deal with and see as a consequence.
And are there any particular demographics that are causing you concern, or are there any particularly concerning trends that you're seeing in extremism and radicalisation?
Very good question. So lots of things keep me awake at night now, and I caught a little bit of what Dame Sara Khan was saying, which I thought was very interesting. I mean, in terms of your question, so the predominant extremist threat in this country still comes from Islamist and extreme right-wing ideologies. I think there is a specific and warranted concern about young people, who I think are particularly vulnerable to extremist narratives and radicalisation. Now, this is in part because of their age and their cognitive development, but there are other factors at play as well. We see this reflected in the rise of the number of young people who are being referred to Prevent and involved in CT investigations. And both the Director General of MI5 and Counter-Terrorism Police have spoken extensively and publicly about their concerns with regard to the increasing number of young people engaged in these activities. I think the latest data is significant. It shows a record number of young people arrested for terrorism-related activity. That was 53 in the year to September 2025. Now, clearly, the online information environment is a key area in this regard. And often young people are using social media and gaming platforms to socialise. And there is obviously concerning evidence that members will be well aware of, that these platforms can be exploited by radicalisers in order to share terrorist content and narratives. It's something that we're spending a lot of time thinking about, and we're determined to make sure that we've got an appropriate policy response, difficult though that is. Do you want to add to that, John?
I might add a few points if that's all right, Minister. So the question also touched on sort of broader trends. I think there's kind of three chunks to this. We see a range of concerning activities across public safety and national security. Some of those are enduring but evolving, such as the terrorist threat, which is my area of expertise. Some are increasing, such as the well-documented increases in hate crime against both the Muslim and the Jewish community. And some of those are emergent, such as the prevalence of individuals fascinated by mass violence or the toxic and dangerous online communities known as comm groups. I know that the committee's interested in the range of those. From our perspective, there are no neat dividing lines between those phenomena, and that particularly plays on me in my role as counter-terrorism director, where I might, for example, find an individual fascinated with violence who also represents a terrorist threat. But there are some common factors, and the Minister's already touched on most of those. There is a common factor about the wide range of extremist ideologies which we are confronting these days across that range of threats. There is a common factor about the prevalence of young people. There is a common factor about the significant incidence of mental ill health and neurodiversity in the caseload associated with many of those challenges. And the Minister's already talked about the online information environment.
Thank you. In 2021, the Operating with Impunity report was published, and it found that the scale of extremist activity that was lawful in Britain was shocking and dangerous, and that laws have failed to keep pace with that. Would you say that 5 years later that the report's findings are still true?
So I was just listening to Dame Sara Khan's evidence on that. I think the second part of the question about the adequacy of our legal response is interesting. I see from my perspective in counter-terrorism a range of legal avenues available to us under the Terrorism Act and associated legislation to tackle extremism where it is a component of terrorism. There are a range of other legal frameworks in use in the Home Office and beyond that can deal with some of the consequences of extremism. We have strong public order legislation, we have strong online legislation, we have strong legislation on hate crime. So it strikes me that when we talk about legal gaps, we are really coming to the point where we're talking about what is and is not lawful when it comes to how an individual thinks. And from my perspective as counter-terrorism director, I have a very clear set of legislation, which is that to hold a set of ideas is not illegal, but once you advocate for serious violence in support of those ideas, that is the point at which we will engage.
Just add, if I may, so I think all of that's absolutely right. I do just want to convey the fact that obviously we keep these things under very careful review. I'm mindful that Lord MacDonald's independent review of public order and hate crime legislation, I think, provides an important opportunity to look at the legislative framework. There are other important contributors to that process, but if the government thinks that there is absolutely a need to legislate, then we won't hesitate to do so.
I think it's just trying to get a sense of whether or not you feel that the current legislation is adequate, and actually whether or not you're going to be considering as a department any changes to policy or changes to resourcing or targets for tackling any new forms of extremism. I suppose, is everything working now?
It's a good challenge. Now, I think it would be unrealistic to say that everything's working in the way that we absolutely want. There are constant pressures on the system, and the kind of the world in which we operate is rapidly evolving. It's the job of government to make sure that there is appropriate level of resource in the right place at the right time, underpinned by the right legislative framework. I think everybody would acknowledge that if we were designing it from scratch, we wouldn't kind of get to where we are. But what we have to do is make sure that we have got the appropriate legislative response. In truth, we'll look very carefully at the recommendations that this committee brings forward and listen to expert opinion, whether that is Lord Anderson or Lord MacDonald or Jonathan Hall, all of whom have got very important contributions to make. I'm broadly content that the arrangements that we've got in place are fit for purpose, but that's not to say that I don't want us to do more and to go further. As a security minister, I'm always going to want to have more resource to kind of manage these particularly gnarly public policy challenges, but that is a kind of a wider conversation that has to be had across government.
There's not currently any plans for any of that? New legislation or wider resources?
Well, we made a commitment, didn't we?
We've made a commitment on, so to cover off a little bit more of the detail, I mean, I have a very long list here of all the relevant legislation. I'm not going to bother reading all of that out, but one example which I think has been highlighted by the Independent Review of Terrorism legislation is the gap in the offence of planning a mass casualty attack, where obviously there is legislation in the Terrorism Act which captures the offence of planning an act of terrorism, but there isn't an equivalent piece of legislation that covers a non-terrorist mass casualty attack. That is something that the government has committed to bringing forward when an appropriate legislative vehicle can be found.
Thank you. And what does the Home Office activities count as counter-extremism measures, and what's the spend for counter-extremism? This is including non-prevent programmes.
Can you pick up the point about resource, Jonathan?
Yes, I can. So on the broader how are we tackling the threat from extremism, the Home Office takes a we do a number of things in the Home Office. So on specifics, we have a programme which stops foreign individuals of extremist concern, including hate preachers and influencers, from travelling to the UK through our visa watch listing programme. We advise and support public authorities and local partners to reduce permissive environments by disrupting extremist events such as speaking tours featuring hate preachers, and both of those things come under the broad ambit of our prevent work. We also invest in capabilities to stop charities being exploited by extremists. The Independent Charity Commission now has an investigative function which it can deploy in this way. Crucially, and to your point about resourcing, we support communities who are targeted by extremists to ensure protective security at their places of worship. And in this financial year, around £70.9 million has been made available to protect faith communities, and that includes uplifts of £10 million each, so a total of £20 million of emergency funding for both Jewish and Muslim communities in the wake of the rise in hate crime and the tragic attack which you saw in Heaton Park. We've also, in the recent past, commenced key provisions of the Online Safety Act in relation to illegal material and the protection of children online, and we've taken tangible steps to protect vulnerable children who are at risk of a terrorism conviction through the introduction of our new youth diversion orders, which are currently moving through the House.
We've got questions on that coming up. So.
Great. You asked about prevent budgets overall. So the Home Office prevent funding for this financial year was in the order of around £39 million, just shy of that, which includes around £6 million worth of funding to 28 priority local authorities, £1.6 million worth of funding for regional prevent and channel advisors, and £2 million worth of funding for civil society organisations who do vital work to counter extremism at the local level.
And just to emphasise the importance that we attach to protecting places of worship. So we've now dedicated record levels of funding in order to enable people to be able to go and worship free from the fear of attack. We've seen terrible attacks on the synagogue and mosques in recent times, and we're absolutely committed to making sure that those places of worship have got the protective security, the resources that they need to enable that important activity.
And do you see a need for a distinct counter-extremism strategy? And how are you actually measuring the impact in your approach to tackling new forms of extremism?
Not a lot about that question, but I'm going to come to the expert first. Could you give the view on the strategy, Jonathan?
I mean, in a sense, it's a slightly challenging question to be asked. I mean, I operate as Counter-Terrorism Director against an extremely clear strategy, which is contest the United Kingdom's counter-terrorism strategy. I engage with colleagues who operate within other strategic framings. So the sort of broad, for me as Counter-Terrorism Director, the role of prevent as part of a broader safeguarding system is obviously really crucial. I don't feel the lack in my role of a strategy because I have my clear counter-terrorism framework. I don't need a strategy to encourage me to work very effectively, I would suggest, with my colleagues in different departments who have adjacent or overlapping responsibilities, which is an inevitable feature of government. This work is complex. That is not to say that there couldn't be some space which could be filled, but I don't feel the lack of it.
And how are you measuring impact?
So in terms of impact, we have a very significant programme of evaluation on how we're delivering our prevent objectives, many of which, of course, touch on counter-extremism. We think prevent is a vital part of our overall counter-terrorism strategy, and I think, as Sara said, we have delivered interventions that supported nearly 6,000 people at risk of being drawn into terrorism since records began in 2015. The first component of measuring success is to ensure independent oversight. Committee members will be familiar with William Shawcross's independent review of Prevent, and also familiar with Lord Anderson's review Lessons for Prevent, and our ongoing efforts to appoint a permanent Prevent Commissioner, which is currently subject to the public appointments process. That independent oversight is crucial. It has been deeply valuable to Prevent to have that expert criticism and those recommendations. We also have a very substantial programme of evaluation inside Prevent. So we are currently undertaking an evaluation of the Channel Multi-Agency Support Programme to really understand where best practice sits across the country, and we're consulting practitioners nationally on that. We've strengthened our approach to assurance and performance monitoring across the whole Prevent system over the last few years. We have an annual Prevent assurance exercise with all local authority leads. We provide local Prevent partnerships, and that provides us and local partnerships, who are so crucial, with assurances that the Prevent duty is being met in proportion to the threat and risk in each area. I could add other points to that, but my point, I think, is when it comes to evaluating our work to prevent people being drawn into terrorism and the associated work to reduce permissive environments, we think we have a very strong picture to paint in terms of our assessment.
I would just add the importance that we attach the appointment of the Independent Prevent Commissioner. So this is a relatively new appointment. Lord Anderson, and anyone who knows him will testify to this, is truly independent of government. And we think that he's got the right experience, the right skill set, the right judgment to provide genuine independent advice to government. We think that that is a good appointment, which we've made because we think that it will be helpful both in terms of informing the work of Prevent, but also in terms of making sure that ministers are accountable as well. So we think that was the right thing to do, and we're keen to kind of invest in that particular role.
Thank you. We've touched a lot on the spread of extremist narratives online, and rightfully so. What progress have you had with tech companies about this, and do you think they actually respect and understand their obligations under the Online Safety Act, particularly regarding their duties to prevent children from actually viewing this?
Come back first and then I'll respond.
So we have a relationship with. So for the first part, we know that Ofcom is now at the stage of implementation, and they've made a number of public commitments, including a public commitment to look in detail at enforcement on at least one major platform over the next 12 months. I think that is a positive step, given the quite strong powers that the Online Safety Act provides to Ofcom and the importance of protecting children's experience online. Again, as Counter-Terrorism Director, that for me is profoundly important for reasons which we'll no doubt get into later on. In the Home Office, we do have direct relationship with technology companies. We provide, as part of that relationship, we provide some of our expertise in assessing the extent of the terrorist and, to a degree, extremist threat online, and helping those companies to understand it in the hope that they will take significant action to counter it. The amount of action taken is variable. It is largely dependent upon the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the conversation, but it is an avenue which we will constantly keep open. I'm sure that somebody will ask about the Australian experience. I have a very close relationship with my Australian counterparts. We talk regularly and are involved in the evaluation of their current set of measures.
And the only thing I would add to that is the importance of the role for other government departments to play in terms of that relationship. You will have heard the statement that's been made today by the Secretary of State for DCIT, Liz Kendall. You would have heard the comments by the Prime Minister specifically with regard to GROC in recent days. So we need to make sure that the online environment is a more permissive environment for younger people than is currently the case. There's a lot of thinking about how best to do that, both internally within government, but also in terms of conversations with our international allies to try and get to a better place than we are now. But the government do take these matters incredibly seriously.
But given Elon Musk's response to the recent Grok AI images, do we think that we're actually making progress with these companies? And if not, what are the government's plans to change that?
Yeah. Again, I think that is an entirely fair challenge. I mean, I think we did make a bit of progress, and that's obviously welcome. But clearly these are incredibly influential entities in their own right with massive resource. And the more that we can join up our work with our international allies, the better, I think. So good to see a bit of progress. Let's see where we get to in terms of the consultation that DCIT have initiated today, but still quite a bit of work to do, to be honest with you, I think.
What are the unique challenges that your department's facing in terms of tackling .com networks?
Com networks, yeah, okay. Do a word on that.
Yeah, I can definitely cover that. So, forgive me for 30 seconds. I mean, the com networks are a really concerning phenomenon. They first came to my attention some time ago in the context of my current role. I'm really grateful to the work, actually, that the National Crime Agency has done on this work. They really have been a driving force behind getting a proper assessment of that risk, and that has been published, and I think the committee will be aware of it in their National Strategic Risk Assessment. That really, for us, highlighted this emergence of comm networks, as sadistic, violent online communities dedicated to inflicting harm and committing serious violent acts. There's also been a lot of media coverage, so none of that would be a surprise. The striking feature of these online communities is that they are engaged in a kind of seemingly limitless variety of criminality. Fraud, cybercrime, child sexual abuse, sextortion, incitement to self-harm, animal abuse, live stream violence, and even at the upper end, extremism and terrorism. The lack of a unifying ideology amongst all of that really does distinguish them from kind of traditional extremism and counter-terrorism work, but can in some ways really amplify their threat. Comm offending is so diverse, and because it's not driven by those sort of traditional ideologies, it crosses a great many threat and harm teams, both in law enforcement and in policy terms, and it's transnational. And offenders may be targeting victims in other jurisdictions, and indeed offenders may be victims, and victims may be offenders in both of those cycles. So effective disruption and identification relies on really good data sharing between law enforcement and really good international cooperation. There has been some success in tackling comm networks. So UK law enforcement, as I think you may be aware, has established a multi-agency task force collaborating with policing, Ofcom and the Home Office to enhance intelligence sharing. That's worked internationally as well. And between October and December last year, we had over 250 referrals, including 52 from international partners, which have had at that stage led to at least 10 arrests in the UK and 16 vulnerable individuals who were safeguarded. It's complex and difficult multi-agency work, and because it is online, it creates challenges of access to the communities themselves.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, just put something very brief on the record, because I feel very strongly about this. So I'm the Minister with responsibility for the National Crime Agency. So that is a very comprehensive description of what we're doing. I would stress the importance of the sort of transnational element of all of this and working with key allies internationally. This is still a relatively new phenomenon. But the National Crime Agency and other partners are deploying a range of very innovative measures to try and disrupt this activity. We are absolutely committed to breaking this particular model, to sowing the seeds of doubt with the people who are engaged with it, and we'll do that through targeted disruption and through prosecutions as well.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Jenny Reid.
We've heard quite a lot of evidence thus far which has suggested that Prevent is effective in tackling and identifying counter-terrorism targets, but not so much with counter-extremism. Is that something that you would agree with? And also, if not, what are your kind of key counter-extremism programmes that you think are most successful?
On that one first.
So I can definitely come in on that one. Thank you, Minister. I mean, at its heart, Prevent is a counter-terrorism programme. And I, of all people, need to be absolutely clear on that. There is a slight subtlety in that the Prevent duty requires specified authorities such as education, health, local authorities and so forth to help prevent the risk of people becoming terrorists or supporting terrorism. And so inevitably, when we look at our delivery model, which is in 3 chunks, the first of those, and in some ways the one with the broadest base, is to tackle the ideological causes of terrorism by focusing on reducing the influence of radicalisers on susceptible audiences. As I think your previous witness said, some of those radicalisers historically have been very, very adept at flying just below the threshold to terrorism. Indeed, Anjem Choudhury was mentioned, and I note with no small degree of satisfaction that he is currently serving a significant sentence at His Majesty's pleasure. So, you know, that part of the Prevent programme, which is about reducing the influence of radicalisers on susceptible audiences, of building resilience in susceptible audiences, actually, which is one of the ways in which we work with civil society, and reducing the availability of and access to terrorist content online, I think is really important and touches, if I may, on the very upper end of counter-extremism, where it is a direct link into terrorism. Beyond that, the focus of Prevent is absolutely on terrorism risk. Our early intervention programme is, of course, trying to get to individuals who are not at that stage of their journey an actual committed terrorist, because frankly if they were they would be investigated rather than supported in this way, but is nonetheless very clearly trying to identify people who are on that pathway and intervene in them. And obviously our rehabilitation programme, which has largely worked with the prison population, is directed at those who have been convicted of terrorism offences.
Right, I think we have a vote. I will have to suspend the sitting, but if we could come back, please. I believe it's just one vote, so if we could be back for 4:30, that would be appreciated. Thank you. Order. Order. Thank you for getting back so promptly. We will make a start because I'm very conscious that the Minister has had a long day and we don't want to make it any longer than we absolutely have to. So we'll continue with the questions, and we're moving on to talk about Prevent and how it might be adapted or possibly enhanced, or other systems that could be used to help to deal with those people who have a propensity to violence, who have a propensity to extremism, but don't meet the criteria to go into the full Prevent programme and channel. And to start off, we've got Margaret Mullane.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, the committee had a visit to the National Crime Agency. So what you're saying, they are doing outstanding work. But what kind of really struck us that day from all of us visiting was the sheer scale and complexity of what they're dealing with online that would not meet the Prevent, really. So we've spoke a lot about Prevent earlier, but as the Chair has alluded to, it's the nature and the scale of the kind of online crime that is what we're all really concerned about. And we just wonder, aside from what Jonathan Emmett's already said, what action are you taking to sort of identify the blind spots that Prevent doesn't have, and the I can't emphasise this enough, the very concerning behaviour that currently takes place online?
Great question. I'm going to bring Jonathan in because he knows a lot about it. Let me just make a couple of points before I do. The first, and I think that you've heard this from, well, firstly, thank you for commending the work of the National Crime Agency. I think they do incredibly important work, and I'm not convinced that they always get the recognition that they deserve. I was just about to respond to a point earlier with regard to Prevent, and I think Lord Anderson, I've heard him make this point previously, that when Prevent goes wrong, when it falls short, there are potentially very significant consequences, and it will be leading the news. But what doesn't happen is the very much attention for all of those occasions where it does succeed. And whilst the Prevent programme itself is not perfect, and we do want to make it as effective as it possibly can be, I think it's worth acknowledging the extraordinary contribution made by those who work within the Prevent programme. Thinking about the footprint right around the country, I've visited a lot of different parts of the UK where we've got people engaged in difficult, complicated work who often feel like that they don't necessarily get the recognition that they deserve. Let me bring in Jonathan to come to the specific point that I think we've touched on a bit in terms of the online environment.
Thank you, Minister. So it's a sort of blind spot question, and I'm mindful of the Chair's instruction to sort of look beyond Prevent. But I emphasise that my expertise is there, but I will seek to do so. So, I mean, we agree with Lord Anderson's assessment of both the importance of the role of the online information environment when it comes to radicalisation, to terrorism, its relevance to other risks as well, and the fact that responses to it are really, really, really hard. Taking the example of Prevent, but thinking about applying it more broadly, we are asking a range of public sector professionals who come into contact with individuals who may be at risk to assess that risk, and then we are saying, and our research is telling us that a major risk factor, not the only one, but a major risk factor, is the nature of those people's online lives, which by definition is very unlikely to be visible to those professionals. That is a wicked problem if ever there was one. And so, look, the Home Office, obviously we work with technology companies both in the counter-terrorism space and in a range of other spaces, with an interest in trying to think about how, in a way which is proportionate with the values of a democratic society, you can both identify people on the basis of their online activity who may pose a risk to others, in some cases, in the case of terrorism, the most serious risk to others, but in other cases, also very serious risks, and also whether there might be approaches you can take to seeking to divert those people, if you like, in their natural environment. So divert them online by providing different off-ramps which can almost warn them when they're engaged in behaviour which might be risky or indeed deeply antisocial. That is really difficult work. The details of it, I don't think for this discussion here, but it is something that we're really clearly engaged with. I think the final thing I'd say is none of that should detract from the fact that platforms have legal duties here. They have a legal duty under the Online Safety Act. It is really important, as the government has said, that we back Ofcom to do the role that they've been asked to do, which is very difficult, but in enforcing the provisions of that important and indeed world-leading legislation.
Yeah, so could I just come back? So it's acknowledged that it's something that Prevent can't do because they're doing enough, aren't they? So we don't want to go back over Prevent again. So what we kind of spoke about very loosely, obviously I won't share with you now, a lot of those behaviours and what was actually happening was absolutely terrifying, and safeguarding issues and safety and many other issues. So with what you've just responded to us, are you waiting for something, or are you moving it forward, or is there a different action outside of what you've already stated today?
Would you like me to take that?
Yes, please.
So we're obviously watching very closely the implementation of our own Online Safety Act and the Australian experience. Both of those are examples of where one relies on sort of broad-based regulation to try and buy down risk. And as I've said, separately, both in the CT space and more broadly, we are looking at other measures that we can take proactively to try to either identify at-risk individuals or divert them, no matter what their offending path. My expertise is in counter-terrorism. We're certainly in that business. I know that my colleagues, for example, who deal with child sexual exploitation and abuse would say absolutely that they are in a similar business, and we talk very frequently about what is technically possible and crucially the partnership that we need to have with technology companies upon whose infrastructure any such capability would need to sit. Those are challenging conversations.
The only point I would add to that is that we don't own a number of the policy levers that sit with other government departments. So there's an obvious importance to make sure that we're joining up our response across government, working very closely with DCIT, but with other government departments as well.
Are you using any online tools to when somebody accesses a certain website or puts certain terminology into a search engine, are you using any tools that will flash up a warning sign that, do you really want to look at this content? Do you really want to see this? Is there anything around that the government's looking at?
That's not currently a capability which we're deploying.
But when we do it on child sexual exploitation, there is the capability there. So is it possible to move that capability, to replicate that capability, so that people going down these rabbit holes can be identified and stopped using AI, which Peter Prinsley was talking about in the last session as well?
I mean, that's exactly the sort of thing that I'm talking about when I describe the need to look at how we divert people from paths in different ways, and that's one thing we can consider.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Nicola.
Thank you. Dame Sara criticised the Home Office and ministers for using words terrorism and extremism interchangeably. Do you recognise that charge?
I am very sorry that I didn't hear what she said because I was otherwise occupied. I think you were here, Jonathan, for it. Yeah, I think you did catch.
I did catch Dame Sara's evidence. I must, unless that may come at the very end, which I missed. I didn't catch that particular.
You don't need to.
No, I know.
That's what she said.
I didn't catch that particular point. I mean, I hope that from a counter-terrorism director perspective, I've been very, very clear on the distinction between the two, which is for us a legal and a practical distinction. Do we have to deal with both? Yes, we do, at the upper end of extremism and once we cross the threshold into terrorism. But I would hope that we do not use them interchangeably and that our use of language is very deliberate.
I mean, I've got a huge amount of respect. She's got a huge amount of experience in this area, so I'll look very carefully at what she said. I mean, we do want to work with Dame Sara. I think she brings a weight of experience and credibility and authority, and we're keen to listen and act upon her advice.
Okay, we'll let that pass. I think in this conversation you've done it a couple of times, but we'll see. Prevent's an early intervention tool for identifying those at risk of committing terrorism. What about those who are simply at risk of falling prey to extremism? What should we be doing for them?
I can kick us off.
Yeah, I can definitely kick us off there. So one of the things, and we may get onto this later, one of the current features of our Prevent system is a relatively large number, although in public policy terms a relatively modest number, but a large number of referrals, and a relatively smaller number of those referrals which identify a risk of being drawn into terrorism. One of the perfectly reasonable questions that a lot of people ask is, what happens to the rest? What happens to the rest is that they are signposted to other areas of support. So to sort of partially answer your question, how would we deal and prevent with somebody who was at risk of exposure to extremist ideology, but not on a pathway to terrorism. That is a very finely balanced operational decision, but how we would deal with them is to, if appropriate, refer them onward to another service for support, be that education, social work, or indeed health, if any sort of mental ill health or neurodiversity was an issue.
Yeah, those are the ones who have wrongly been pushed to prevent. But what about those who clearly aren't being pushed to prevent because there's not a risk of terrorism? They're family members particularly concerned about a child or a loved one going down that rabbit hole, not worried about terrorism, not wanting to go down the security route. What are the routes for that person?
I think it'd be helpful if you talked to the safeguarding route.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, essentially, and please do respect the fact that this is beyond my purview, but that is broader safeguarding. So from my experience, Prevent sits as part of a broader safeguarding network. It is certainly not necessary to refer somebody to Prevent in order to access that wider safeguarding network. That is done very, very regularly. I think it was David Anderson that quoted a shockingly high number of sort of 600,000 odd referrals for children who might be at risk every year. And I've no doubt that some of those concerns would be appropriately picked up in that broader safeguarding
we've
system.
heard evidence from other witnesses that the Prevent system is being used because there is no other route. It's being used for those with mental health problems, those with fear of extremism, or subject to extremism. Now, your answer would be what? Oh, well, it doesn't matter because they'll get, at the channeling point, they'll get pushed to something else. Is that what you're saying?
I think it's worth making the point about the quality of referrals.
Yes, absolutely. I would first slightly disagree with the premise. There are many other routes for individuals who may be at risk to receive an appropriate level of support, and it is absolutely not the case that Prevent, as it's conceived today or as it operates today, is that sole gateway. It's simply not. Well, this will be broader safeguarding, so the normal work of child and adult mental health services, of school safeguarding officers, and many others involved in that.
Evidence we've heard is there aren't, that these possibilities don't exist. In reality, people use Prevent to try and get some sort of help. But you're telling me they're just not using the safeguarding processes that are out there.
I think I can say with confidence that other safeguarding processes are available and appropriate for risks that fall below a terrorism threshold. The process which is undergone in Prevent is once we triage for that terrorism risk, if that terrorism risk is not in our view present, then we refer back into a pre-existing safeguarding route. So it is not the case that there is a sort of gateway that exists on that. Does that clarify?
Perhaps you could send us details of that, because we've not heard that much evidence that these other routes are really existing. But
We'd be very happy to do that. I just wanted to emphasise again the importance of joining it up across government. So whilst the Home Office is the departmental lead, my strong view is actually it will only ever be made to work if we've got the buy-in of other government departments, and health is a kind of key contributor to that process, and that's why I engage very closely with ministerial colleagues in the health department and in education as well.
yes, and that's clearly important, that coordination going a bit beyond particular departments, and your role in both now makes sense. According to the 2014 counter-extremism strategy, the Prime Minister of the day chaired regular cabinet-level task force meetings on counter-extremism work. Does that still happen today? We've seen no recent evidence of that. Is that still happening?
I'm sort of casting my mind back to that was David Cameron. I mean, to be fair to David Cameron, he invested a huge amount of time in the processes of the National Security Council. I can say to you that the Prime Minister is personally invested in these issues. I know he takes a very keen interest, and I know that there is a regular conversation between him and senior cabinet ministers, including the Home Office.
There's no task force chaired by the current Prime Minister in the same way as there was under David Cameron. Is that what you're telling me?
I mean, there are still the structures of the National Security Council which provide the most appropriate forum to discuss these matters with cabinet members and with.
I'm not criticising. I'm just asking a question. But there's no task force chaired by the Prime Minister.
It's a fair challenge. There isn't a kind of formal task force as such, but I can genuinely reassure you the Prime Minister's personal interest in this, and the Home Secretary's. Okay,
and working with local authorities and communities, how is central government doing that?
You do local government
coordination. I mean, so I've described the role of Prevent in supporting local communities to counter extremism in their areas where that's creating a permissive environment for terrorism. It's absolutely crucial to us that Prevent is at its heart delivered locally, because it is those local authorities and other public service providers in the area who have the best understanding about risk in their area, who come together to form the multi-agency channel panel and who make the very difficult decisions about where individuals might need further support, and indeed where they might not, and might need to be referred back, to your earlier question, into other local services. So we support local authorities in a number of ways. The first thing we do is we have a national network of Prevent advisors. Those are based regionally, and they support all of the local authorities in their region to deliver their Prevent duty. We also have a network of quality assurers who support, I would argue, support local authorities by quality assuring the work that is done, particularly in channel panels, to give assurance to those local authorities that it is being done well. We provide financial support to the 28 local authorities who we assess at greatest risk in the context of Prevent and counter-terrorism, and so on and so forth. So quite a significant amount.
What was the role of community coordinators in all of this?
Is that your phrase or my phrase? I said Prevent regional advisor.
It's a Home Office phrase, but you stopped funding them in 2021. I was just wondering what they did and why you stopped funding them.
I mean, that would be the point at which we started to shift our Prevent delivery model. So that delivery model is now, we would argue, more efficient and effective, and it's based on a regional advisor model. So we have 20 regional advisors based up and down the country who provide, between them, support to all of them.
And what are those 20 doing what the 35 community coordinators used to do, or was it a different role, or do you not know? Is that something you could?
So I mean, I couldn't give you a blow by blow on the job description, but we have sharpened very considerably the way in which we deliver Prevent to put in place some of the points of assurance that I talked about earlier, and we believe that we are achieving more effective outcomes with fewer resources deployed in that way.
I would just add, I mean, this is where the rubber hits the road. So it's an entirely fair challenge. I mean, I met with the Chief Exec in London who coordinates activity across London. I was the Chief Constable and the Deputy Mayor for Police in Greater Manchester specifically to talk about these issues. I mean, the Home Office Prevent advisors do incredibly important work with local authorities, making sure that they've got the technical expertise and the support to do a very difficult job. But that link to the local authorities is a really important part of all of this.
And you are aware of the LGA's criticism of this?
Yes.
Yes. And your answer to the charge is we're doing it better with less resources. Is that it?
Yes.
Okay.
Emma Maguire.
I just wanted to follow up on Paul Kohler's point there, because one of the pieces of evidence that Dame Sara mentioned earlier was a bit of a black hole, essentially, and going back to what Paul was talking about in terms of the stage before Prevent, so not at the terrorism stage. And I know, Jonathan, you've already mentioned the safeguarding system, which is fair enough. One of the things that Dame Sara was talking about, there doesn't seem to be much monitoring, if at all, and please do correct me if I've got this wrong, on the pathway between that safeguarding piece into Prevent, and Dame Sara was almost alluding to the need for almost a prevent body which tackles the extremism before it gets to the stage of terrorism. And I'd just be quite interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Conscious of the world in which you then have a kind of prevent, but I'll hand over to you.
Or is there any monitoring to see that whether we need that or not?
Yeah, good point.
Gosh, I mean, there is an awful lot in this, which sort of plays to my earlier point about safeguarding, and it touches upon some of the recommendations made by Lord David Anderson in his report, Lessons for Prevent, where he talked in effect about the challenge for Prevent being that it conducts a triage based on looking for one thing. It's not in the business of skilled to or funded to conduct a triage based on looking for a range of risk factors.
I don't think anyone's suggesting that. It's more the point before that, whether the data is being recorded to see whether the safeguarding that you're talking about, which presumably goes off to the local government agencies, is being tracked and monitored to see if that then later goes on to form part of Prevent. So it's kind of separate and outside of Prevent, really. I'm not suggesting, and I don't think anyone's suggesting that Prevent should pick up that slack.
I'm afraid I would definitely suggest that is beyond my purview. We have a very good sense of where referrals into Prevent come from, but I do not have data, and it's beyond my responsibility.
Do you know if that data exists, or it's just not out there?
I'm afraid I don't.
You could write
It's
to
an
us.
entirely fair, quite technical but fair challenge, so let's come back to this.
Right,
You
thanks.
could write to
We
us.
will do that.
Margaret Mullane.
Yeah, could I just ask, you fund the 28 areas that are at greatest risk. Is that monitored? And sort of touching on what Dame Sara said, her evidence before, the kind of social cohesion as well. Are you monitoring that with those 28 greatest at risk areas?
Yeah, you come in first.
I mean, the short answer to that is yes. So I won't go into the sort of entire process of how we determine which areas are most at risk, although I would be very happy to sort of spell that out at a later date if necessary. But we take into account a range of factors, some of which relate to absolute kind of high-end terrorism risk, but obviously the extent to which a local area has a permissive environment or is at risk of having a permissive environment is part of that package and would inform where we put our funding. And I should add that is additional funding. Every local authority area has a legal duty to comply with the Prevent duty, and that includes reducing that permissive environment.
And it's also another reason why we've got the Home Office Prevent Advisors. So in addition to the resource that is available, there's also technical expertise that can be deployed to provide support in a given area if there's a request from a local authority.
You talked about other safeguarding pathways. Is anybody in government or anywhere monitoring those individuals who've been referred to Prevent have gone into some other safeguarding pathway? Does anyone know what happens to them?
So that's a really good question. It is one which has come up in the context, of course, of the aftermath of the dreadful attack in Southport. We expect Sir Adrian Fulford's inquiry to make some recommendations in this regard in his first phase. I would anticipate more recommendations in this regard in his second phase. We have not waited for either of those things, and in Prevent we have undertaken a pilot programme which is coming to its conclusion to track some of those outward referrals from Prevent, which, to be clear, do not represent a counter-terrorism risk, and nonetheless to track those and determine whether there is a way in which we can gain assurance about what is subsequently done with them. That is ongoing work.
And I think, just to make the point, we've had evidence throughout that Prevent really is doing good work and, pay tribute to Prevent. As I say, what we're interested in is
beyond
the people who are not qualifying for Prevent, and we don't want to dilute Prevent. We don't want Prevent to suddenly become an all-sing, all-dancing safeguarding mechanism. Prevent has a very specific purpose, but it's how do we get to the people that are not right for Prevent and shouldn't be in Prevent, but have a propensity to violence. And on that, I'm going to bring in Robbie Moore.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to just focus a bit on the Prevent duty, because we know that local authorities, education providers, health providers are mandated under the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act to deliver and be aware of how to make referrals into the Prevent programme. But that doesn't cover the issue of extremism. It's just those where there is a duty associated with terrorism. For reasons that we've explored on this committee so far, do you think it is right that extremism isn't included within the Prevent duty?
Go first, I'll come in on
I have to be slightly careful. So, as I explained earlier, the sort of three layers of the Prevent duty, that first layer of tackling the ideological causes and focusing on reducing the influence of radicalisers on susceptible audiences will absolutely capture those at the upper end of the extremism risk, where, as I think again I said earlier, there are individuals or groups who operate deliberately below a threshold, but who are part and parcel of the risk picture which I look at as a counter-terrorism director and want to address. So to that extent, we are absolutely interested in that. The second thing I will say is when we get to the early intervention programme, which most people think of as Prevent, we are not sifting for, in a sense, we are not sifting for people who've committed to a path of terrorism. We are looking for something rather more subtle, and this is a really challenging job for counter-terrorism police upon whom we rely to assess this. But we're looking for people who are at risk of being drawn into that path. And so, of course, their experience of an engagement with extremist narrative and ideology is a really important component, but it's not sufficient in and of itself to necessarily hit that bar, and that is the really difficult job that we ask channel panels up and down the country to do. Well, police, counter-terrorism police in the initial trios, and then channel panels in the discussion of those cases, and that is challenging. So I slightly push back on the prevent doesn't do, but you're right in the extent that, of course, we are not in the business of, if an individual holds views which are extreme and many might consider to be reprehensible, that is not a matter for prevent.
In the earlier panel as well, Dame Sara was making the point that those that fall more into the terrorism category are more likely to be Islamist ideologically driven, and those that are more in the extremist category are more falling into far-right extremism. Do you think, therefore, just as a supplementary to the question I've already asked, that actually the scope of the prevent duty is wide enough? And do you recognise the categorisation of what I've just said about Dame Sara's comments?
I'm not sure that I could point to evidence right now which recognises Dame Sara's comments, but neither any which would disagree with it. She is certainly correct to say that the most significant terrorist threat is absolutely an Islamist extremist terrorist threat. It is also true that there is a very significant and serious extreme right-wing terrorist threat in the United Kingdom today, and the Director General of MI5 is on record on that. One of the things which is often said to me as counter-terrorism director is, how do I square that with the relatively low, but still significant, on a population basis, certainly significant number of Islamist extremist referrals into prevent, versus a relatively high number of referrals for extreme right-wing terrorism related risk. It's a complex issue. My simple answer to that is in two parts. One, we are taking very strenuous steps to ensure that we have calibrated our system to be appropriately sensitive to Islamist extremist risk. That will always be an ongoing process, and I can talk about it if the committee is interested. But secondly, that Prevent is looking for a different thing than MI5. MI5 is looking at hardened and committed terrorists who are intending to conduct attacks. We are looking for people who are on a pathway, and we want to intervene before they get there. And so we would expect there to be a differential of demographic, if you like.
Okay, and then so just so that you can establish confidence to us as the committee members, what action are you taking to ensure that everyone who undertakes the prevent duty is confident and competent to identify and refer individuals that have been identified to have concern?
Sorry, I missed the last part of the question.
In terms of training for competence.
Yeah, the training side of things.
Training for competence more generally.
Confidence.
With apologies, I will be there in one
While you're finding that, could you just expand on the nature of the organisations that deliver the programmes and whether you have confidence that they are delivering the programmes appropriately?
So the nature of the organisations to deliver programmes, that would be other civil society organisations with whom we work. We've got a network of 68 civil society organisations, and of course, prior to working with and during our relationship, we make sure that we conduct appropriate due diligence checks on those organisations so we can have high confidence in the quality of their work. And further, anybody, so when we're talking about training for Prevent, what we rely on very heavily is a network of around 900 trainers who come from all sorts of different organisations, who put themselves forward to be accredited by the Prevent programme, who both undergo training and then have a stringent knowledge check before they are allowed to deliver training on aspects of the Prevent duty, including the Islamist extremist ideology. Since in November last year, we rolled out specific additional ideologically focused training on Islamist extremism. That's now been delivered to, I think, at least 50 groups, and will continue to be delivered and refined, and sort of taken together. All of those things and the channel assurance team that I talked about earlier are all designed as checks and balances inside that system to try to make sure that everyone inside it is equipped with the knowledge that they need to make the very difficult decisions that we ask them to.
I think I would just, it's a good point, just to acknowledge one particular point of challenge. So essentially there's a reliance here on frontline professionals who are able to identify concerns and make a referral. That is harder to do online. So there's some specific challenges about how we can more effectively detect concerning online behaviour to inform high quality referrals.
Okay. And just final question for me is what assessment, if any, has been done on the quality of referrals that have been made under the prevent duty?
You do. That's fine. I mean, we work really closely with counter-terrorism police. They receive the referrals, and we, my team, to work very closely with them to understand any issues with the referral quality. We look at implementing, we have implemented quarterly regional meetings with local partners to identify specific issues in their region and to ensure consistent application of national policy and examine local delivery. This is always a balance. Local delivery partners know their region and they know the risks. There are national standards, including knowledge that we have about, for example, Islamist extremism and how that is working in the modern world and how it is working online. And so, as well as tracking the quality of referrals, what I think is crucial is the work that we do to disseminate knowledge from government about those risks to those local partners, which we do very regularly, including products from the Research Information and Communications Unit, which is part of the Prevent team.
I suggest in the interest of time you may want to write to us on some of these matters. No, I'm just conscious of time, and I don't want to interrupt, Minister, but I'm conscious
if I could just provide an additional point of reassurance. So I've instigated a monthly meeting with CT Police that I chair along with senior Home Office officials to look precisely at that issue and make sure that we're getting it right.
Okay, thank you.
And Paul Kohler, and then we're going to go on to youth diversion orders with Ben Maguire, and if we've got time we'll bring in Peter Prinsley on the Anderson review.
Just a quick one, picking up what Robbie was asking. I totally understand why the duty to refer should only apply to those who are thought to meet the threshold, the prevent threshold. If there are, I'm still sceptical, there is these other safeguarding routes for those who are subject to extremism. Is there a duty to refer them to such of these routes, or should there be a duty?
Anyone can make a referral.
Should there be a duty, though? On the same people that are under a duty to refer to prevent?
I mean, so there's sort of two-part question there, isn't there? So one, Minister's absolutely right. Anyone can refer to prevent, and should, if they think that there's a risk, and there's very good guidance available online, including to members of the public. First point. Second point, I think, is more broadly in safeguarding. I'm afraid I am not an expert in safeguarding duties. I know a number of legal duties apply to individuals in particular roles, and if necessary, we can write to the committee on that.
When you come back to us on these routes, if you could do duty, that'd be good.
So we'll just spend the last few minutes on youth diversion orders with Ben Maguire.
Great, thanks. We've talked briefly earlier about the fact that lots of these cases don't quite meet the terrorism threshold. Quite interested to hear what you are considering in the way of further measures to increase police powers to be able to intervene in cases of violence fixated individuals where they don't quite meet that terrorism threshold, but clearly pose a form of risk. I'm quite interested to hear how you're looking to tackle that, particularly through policing powers, but obviously mindful of additional budgets as well. I mentioned to Dame Sara earlier that my local force is really struggling in terms of funding at the moment, so how that burden wouldn't just be put onto the police, and what your thoughts are on that.
The youth diversion order is designed for terrorism-related cases, but in terms of the good point about pressures on the police, can you pick that one up, John?
Yeah, so there's a two-part question. I'll be brief, Chair. So one, YDOs, I think we'll come on to the detail of in a minute.
Yeah.
Violence-fascinated individuals. So I think I'd say a couple of things. One, a violence-fascinated individual could well also have a terrorism-associated risk. We will deal with them in prevent, and rightly so, and indeed in other parts of the terrorism system if we needed to. But you're right that there are gaps. The IRTL identified a particular legislative gap. The government has committed to fill that, which is the planning of mass casualty attack. The government will bring forward legislation when appropriate vehicles found. Beyond that, we do await Sir Adrian Fulford's report into phase 1 and indeed following from that phase 2, and we anticipate there being some very significant recommendations which the government will respond to in full.
And what timetable was there for that, sir? Approximately?
I think Sir Adrian's report is due at the end of April, so just over a year after the inquiry began.
Great, thanks for that. And then moving on to the youth diversion orders, which you mentioned, how do you see those being used to counter extremism, and how would you measure the success of that?
Yeah, so youth diversion orders are a counter-terrorism measure. I should be abundantly clear on that. We see in the most recent set of Terrorism Act statistics saw 53 young people, a record high, arrested for counter-terrorism offences in the course of the preceding 12 months. We have long been concerned about the increase in minors in our CT casework across the whole range, from prevent and into the very hard end of pursue. And as a result, we were very pleased by Jonathan Hall's recommendation, another one from him, for some sort of youth diversion order, which provides us with a non-judicial pathway for individuals who are nonetheless engaged in quite serious activity, including potentially terrorism-related offending. We envisage that those will be used, but there's a measure going through the House now, so I can't give you a sense of the final shape of it, but that we envisage that being used by policing to mandate conditions upon an individual, both restrictive but crucially also supportive, as a way of mandating engagement with, for example, some of the techniques that we've long used in our Prevent programme, an intervention provider tailored to a particular individual's risk profile who can divert them away from a pathway which would otherwise lead to terrorism offending.
And is that not a model that could then be used, because you said earlier you almost identified the gap, violence fixated individuals that don't quite meet the terrorism threshold. Is there a particular reason why those youth diversion orders can't be used in that gap, as it were?
I mean, I think that is a good point. It's early days, so I think we'd want to keep that under close review. But in terms of the basic principle, I don't see why that wouldn't be the case, but we're not quite there yet.
Right, okay, thanks.
I think we've reached our time, and we did say we'd get you out by 5 p.m, Minister, so thank you very much. I was going to say, I know you've had a very long and arduous day, so I appreciate you coming before the committee, but it will mean that we can complete our work in this area and we can get a report out. We will be making significant recommendations, I think, around how government could work on this, based a lot on the evidence we've received, but also Lord Anderson's review and other issues. But again, appreciate you coming before us, appreciate you staying that little bit longer, and I will call this to a close. Order. Thank you.
Thank you.